Welcome to this training video on return material authorizations. My name is Anne and I'm going to go through return material authorizations and repair tracking. Some of the features of return material authorizations are it allows you to manage the returns process. You have one document as a single point of reference for each RMA. You can track the RMA by user-definable status and workflow stage codes, and it enables fault code and repair agent tracking. It provides a central repository of data for all tracking and reporting on RMAs. From the one document, you can generate the associated transactions without rekeying any of the information. You can create order entry credit notes or order entry replacement orders for damaged goods or warranty repairs. You can also create order entry sales orders for repairs, where you ship and invoice the spare parts and labor. You can also create PO returns for items to be returned to your supplier. And you have user-definable templates, so you can apply rules for the different types of repairs or returns that you're doing. And these rules can be tailored for the customer type or product type that you're working with. The overall process flow for RMA is once the customer calls and says they're going to return an item or send an item in for repair, is to create the RMA. And this could be for an item that's going to be returned, or an item that needs replacing, or an item for repair. And then when the item arrives, it can be inspected or repaired or worked on, and a decision made that either we're going to issue an OE credit note for that item, or we're going to do a PO vendor return for that item, and we may be doing replacement items or spare parts that need to be issued from stock. At this stage, until the credit note vendor return or the issue of the sales order for replacing the items is issued, there is no movement of stock. But when the credit note is created, an IC transaction would be created if the credit note was of type return to stock. And if returning to your vendor, i.e. you create a PO vendor return, then the item will be taken out of your stock. And for your replacement goods, it's only once you ship the sales order that the items will be taken out of stock, and that's the same for spare parts that might be used on repairs. The topics for the training are to activate the module. We're going to install and activate the module, check the license file, and then assign the visual process flows, which helps you with the transaction processing in RMA. We're going to run through the configuration options, through all the different codes that you can use, the authorizations, the external status, fault type, workflow stage, repair agent, and optional fields if you're using them. And then we're going to look at the different types of item policies you can set up for those items that you don't allow returns or don't allow returns within a certain period. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the different templates that you can use. RMA general templates, customer-specific templates, or entire documents which can be set up as templates. Then we'll process some RMAs using the different template codes. Have a look at the reports by stage and status, fault code, open, closed, or credit note. And we'll look at the customer return rate report and the item return rate report. And we'll also look at the periodic processing options, which allows you to clear down completed RMAs and clear down expired RMAs. To install RMA or an RMA product update, you go to our website, www.orchid.systems, log in, click on Product Downloads, select the version you want, and then scroll down to find the module that you want. Per version, we have the sample data, the object model for all our modules, the NFR serial numbers that you can use for 30-day activation, and then all the modules. And RMA is down here. After downloading, you would install the module by running the install shield that you downloaded, and then connect to the company that you want to activate RMA in, and go into the data activation, select RMA, and activate. After activating, you should go to the Assign the Visual Process Flows and assign for those users that you want to process RMA transactions the RMA visual process flow, as it makes for easier transaction processing. And you can also check your license file by running the RMA registration screen. And if you've activated for 30 days, you can come later and enter the activation code in here. For this training video, I'm going to use Orc Ltd, which is our sample data which has RMA fully configured. In the options, you would fill in the Processing tab to configure RMA. If you want to auto-number your RMAs as opposed to keying in a manual number, you can set an overall prefix, number length, and next RA number on this particular screen. And here you specify the number of days before an RMA expires. So an expired RMA is one that is entered and 90 days later then deemed to be expired and can be cleared down. The status, fault code, workflow stage, and repair agents are all status codes that can be attached to each RMA detail line, and you can make these fields mandatory, either at a system-wide level or on a template-by-template code. So here at a system-wide level, we're saying they can be blank, they're not mandatory, but on certain templates, I might turn on some of these codes and make them mandatory. For example, warranty repairs, I'll make fault code tracking mandatory. Once we've created our templates, we can come back and fill in a default template code, so all new RMAs get created under that template code, or we can leave it blank and associate it with the customer to get default templates happening per customer, or we can leave it blank and the user can choose which template they want to use per RMA. And these are the options similar to order entry and purchase orders, whether or not you allow the serial numbers or lot numbers to be blank on the RMA. And as with all Orchid products, we have an Update tab that you can click on to check if you're on the most current product update. And you can select this option if you want to be notified if there are new updates when you log on to the Sage 300 company. The authorization codes are used when you have validations for an RMA based on the template code, and for a particular RMA document you want to override the validations. An example validation would be that the original invoice is mandatory on the RMA document. So you can set yourself up RMA authorizations, provide a user ID, a password, and if you've enabled authorization to approve RMAs, then this user, Albert, would be able to go in and override the default template settings. So Albert is not able to do that, but Anne is. So at the time of authorizing or approving an RMA, I would have to provide my password so that the template validations would not apply to that particular document. Every RMA detail line has an external status, and this is typically used for the status from the customer. So the customer phones and says that their item is broken or damaged in transit. They would say what it is, and you record this against the item at the time the RMA is created. We also have fault code tracking. So when you have had time to inspect the item and work out what was indeed wrong with it, you would record those faults in the fault code tracking option. And we also have a workflow stage. So when the customer first reports the RMA, you could say that the RMA status for that particular line is the item is still with the customer. And then when it arrives in the warehouse, you can say arrived in the warehouse. And then when you send it off to the inspection group, the status could be changed to being inspected, and so on through the different status codes. And if you're using repair agents, you can set up a list of repair agents. And when a particular item on an RMA gets sent to a repair agent, then the repair agent code can be added to the RMA detail line. Although there's no connection to AP, we recommend you use the same vendor codes here as you do in AP, because you can print off your RMAs for a period by repair agent code, and that should match the invoice that comes in from that particular vendor. As with core modules, if you have the transactional optional field module, you can set up optional fields on an RMA header level, on the RMA item detail level, or the RMA miscellaneous charge detail level. And when creating credit notes or replacement orders from an RMA, if you have the same optional field defined at the same level, so for example, credit notes, if you have the same optional field on the RMA document header as you do on the credit note document header, then the optional field will flow from the RMA to the credit note, or from the RMA to the replacement sales order. And the final general setup we have is email templates. So when you create an RMA, either for a repair or a return, you can customize your email templates. And then when the RMA is created, the email can be sent to the customer. And in this case, it's intended that this email gets printed off, attached to the goods, and then sent back into our warehouse. Item policies allow you to define what rules you have for your items. For example, you may not allow repairs or returns for certain items. So per item, you can say whether or not you're allowed to do credit notes and the number of days beyond the date of invoice that you're allowed to do credit notes. So for this particular item, we cannot do a credit note 30 days after the date of the invoice. If this was zeros, then you couldn't do a credit note at all for this particular item. And whether or not you allow replacement items to be sent can be set here at an item by item level. So in this case, we're saying that the dry erase whiteboard markers cannot be replaced and they can only be credited if they're returned within 30 days. If there is no item policy record for an item, then it is assumed that you can do credit notes and replacement orders for that item. And before we consider the detailed setup of the RMA templates, you should also consider the security groups for RMA in admin services. So you need to configure which users can do the setup, the document entry, the posting, the deletion of documents, and other daily tasks in RMA processing. In this training, I'm going to go through a few template examples. First, we're going to do some returns templates where we want to create a matched credit note. Matched credit note being the credit note will be matched to the invoice, and we want to charge a restocking fee as a percentage of the returns or a fixed amount, and a second returns template where we're going to replace the items. And then we're going to look at some repairs templates where we want to do warranty repairs where there's no charge for the parts or labor, or normal repairs where we do want to charge for the parts and labor. The first example we're going to do is the returns template with a restocking fee, and we're going to create a matched credit note and a vendor return to return those items back to our supplier. On the template rules, we're going to use the template numbering feature where we can number each RMA document based upon the template so we can visually quickly check which RMAs we're using. We're going to make the invoice mandatory on all the RMA lines. So for any return, we need to provide the invoice first. And when we create a credit note, we're going to match the credit note to the invoice. We're also going to automatically charge a restocking fee based on a percentage of the RMA value. Our other option is to do a fixed restocking fee. And then we're going to create the RMA from the invoice document and apply the template rules. And then we're going to create a matched credit note, and then we're going to create a vendor return. For our template codes, we can define as many template codes as we want, and it contains the rules that we want to apply to repairs or returns under that template. The first one we're going to look at is the returns template with the restocking fee as a percentage of the RMA price. You can set the default values of fields on the RMA header, the RMA item details, so these are items that are added to the RMA, on the miscellaneous charges that are added to the RMA, and overall processing rules for the RMA. First, looking at the RMA header fields, we are going to default the description and the comment, but we can also default the authorized by, the shipping reference, and the ship via. And we've selected to automatically charge a restocking fee using the miscellaneous charge code of RET 10, and we've entered the percentage here on the RMA template. So we're going to charge a restocking fee of 10% of the return. And we're going to put the RMA number into the replacement order, credit note, and vendor return reference field. We could also put it in the description if we wanted to. And when creating credit notes and replacement orders, we can elect to use this salesperson if we want to override the customer's default salesperson for the credit note and for the replacement order, so you don't incorrectly assign additional commission to the original salesperson. And for credit notes, you can specify whether the date of the credit note is the date of the RMA, the date you completed the RMA, or the session date when you click Create Credit Note. And on our item detail, you can override the item category if you want, the item location if you want, and you can set the default status, whether you're going to return the item to inventory or the credit note will be created for damaged items, or the credit note is a price adjustment only. And with respect to the status code, fault code, workflow stage, and repair agent codes, you can make them mandatory if you want. So if we wanted to track fault codes, we could disable this, and then the fault code would be mandatory on each item detail on the RMA. And using these options, you can by default, when you create a replacement order or a credit note or a vendor return, select whether you put the item detail on the replacement order, credit note, or return. So we're doing a returns template. So if we do a replacement order for damaged goods, then we want the item by default to go onto the replacement order. Similarly, if we're going to credit the customer, we want the item by default to go onto the credit note. But in our case, we don't always send the items back to our vendor, so we've not set this as a default. And because we're doing a returns template, if we do replace the items, we're going to create an OE sales order with 0 price for the items that we're going to replace. And in our case, we're defaulting the workflow stage to with the customer. And then as the RMA progresses through our workflow, we would move it on to the different stages. And you've got the same controls on your miscellaneous details. So we're allowing blank stages, status codes, fault codes, and repair agents. And our only default is that we're going to put this miscellaneous charge, which is our restocking fee, onto the credit note. And for the RMA processing, we have nominated RPC as the prefix for any return created under this template. And we have said that we're going to match the credit note to the invoice, and the invoice is required on all items. So we cannot add an item to this RMA if we don't have the invoice number. And after the RMA is complete, we are allowed to come and change non-amount related, so no quantities or no amounts, but we could come and change a fault code or a status of the individual lines. And in our case, we're not using the customer's claim number, and we're not trying to check if we've already used that customer claim number before. And when creating matched credit notes, so that's matched to the original invoice, or unmatched credit notes, we're not going to copy the RMA comments onto that document, but we could, and same for the replacement order and the vendor return. And typically, if you're using template codes, if your customer normally returns items to you and you want to process using a specific template code, you should assign the customer code to a template code, and then you don't need to select the template code each time you create an RMA for that customer. So we're going to do an RMA for customer 1400, who has been assigned to the receipt template code. And you can also have your own specific email address for RMAs for the customer if you fill it in here, and you can specify a default message ID for that customer if you specify it here. So now when we go ahead and create an RMA for customer 1400, the template code defaults as per our customer template code, and we have a miscellaneous charge code added automatically, albeit at this stage 0, because we haven't calculated the RMA yet. So if we want, we can come to the lines and add the items. Because the invoice number is mandatory, we'd specify which invoice number, which item, or if we want, we can select an invoice from our invoice finder. So if we're going to return some items from invoice 7 and some items from invoice 12, we can select invoice 7 and click the Go button. And what RMA does is puts all the items from that selected invoice onto the RMA. And now we can go back and select another invoice if required. So in this case, the customer is saying they're returning these two items, one from invoice 7 and one from invoice 12. And if we look at the detail of these lines, we can either scroll across to see all the columns or look at the F9 zoom. We can see that by default, if we create a replacement order, this item will go on the replacement order and this item will go on the miscellaneous credit note. If it does go on a replacement order, it will be at 0 value. And the status has defaulted to 01. And we can fill in warranty information. If we're selling to distributors who sell to consumers, we could fill in the consumer details and any other information that we want to go onto the replacement order. On the integration tab, it keeps track of the credit note, replacement order, and/or vendor return that has been created for this item. When we go ahead and add this RMA, we can print or email the return instruction to the customer. And here's our RPC return number 2 with these two items and the comment from the RMA. Assuming the customer then sends the items back, we could go and fill in and complete the quantity returned. And we would change the workflow stage of the items. They're no longer with the customer. They've been arrived at the warehouse awaiting inspection, or perhaps they're being inspected, or perhaps you're sending them out to the repair agent. So you'd select the code as what is appropriate, and then somebody would inspect those goods and make a decision. In this case, the customer has returned 2 items, and we can process these both onto a credit note or both onto a replacement order, depending on the results of our inspection. So let's say, for example, this particular item, the one that came from invoice 12, we want to replace that because it was damaged. So we could say yes, and our template has defaulted to put the item on the replacement order and 0 value on the replacement order, but we're going to issue a credit note, but we don't want this item to be credited. So we could turn that off. Whereas our second item that was on invoice 7, in this particular case, we're not going to replace that one. We're only going to put it on the credit note. And if this is now complete, we've decided for invoice 12 item we're going to replace, invoice 7 item we're going to create a credit note. So now we have completed this RMA, but what we need to do is calculate our restocking fee. So when we click calculate restocking fee, it's going to take 10% of our total RMA value of 120 and default that as the price for our restocking fee. And if I complete this document, I can now go ahead and create a credit note, create a sales order, replacement order, and if we want to, a return. Initially, I'm just going to create a credit note. So when I go ahead and create the credit note, it goes through all the lines to see which items are flagged to go on the credit note. And because we're creating match credit notes, it's going to create one credit note per invoice if we were sending multiple invoices through as credit notes. But in this case, we only had the one line going through to a credit note, so it's created the one credit note. And if we have a look at that credit note, it will be applied to the invoice 7. So here's our item for invoice 7, but we've also got the miscellaneous charge code, which reduced the value of our credit note as this was our restocking fee. And if I wanted now to return that item that I had returned to stock as part of the credit note, we could go ahead and fill in a vendor. Just a warning that we'll only get vendor costs for items that have been added to the RMA when the vendor code was already there. So if I do want the return cost to go through, I need to go back to that particular line and confirm the vendor costing. These fields will only be editable before any document has been created for this particular RA detail line. If I do wish to return this item now to my vendor, I could go ahead and create PO return. And in this instance, it didn't create a PO vendor return. And I can see that on my integration tab, it hasn't created a vendor return. And that is because I didn't flag it to put the item on the vendor return. Selecting this option now, and it's giving me a warning that it's going to go through at zero cost. So I should have selected that I was going to put it through to my vendor before creating the credit note. Then I would have had an opportunity to enter the unit cost at that time. But I can still create the vendor return at zero cost by clicking Generate Vendor Return now. And I am able to see that number from the Integration tab on the F9 Detail Zoom. And I can print the vendor return or drill into it from here. And the quantity returned, but at $0 value. The next template we're going to look at is also a returns template, but it's got a fixed price restocking fee. And from this return that we create, we're going to create a replacement order to replace the goods. So on our template rules, we're going to use a template numbering, RET. The invoice will be mandatory. We're going to match credit notes to the invoice if we create one. The restocking fee is a fixed price. Typically, we're going to create a zero value replacement order or credit notes from this template. And we're going to create the RMA from an existing invoice document. And in this case, we're going to show the template rules being applied, but we're going to authorize the RMA to override the template rules to add an item which we have no invoice for. And then we're going to create a replacement order. Using our visual process flow, if we look at the RA template RET, we see we've got the same settings on the RA header, except our restocking fee is 0. But we are overriding the salesperson on the replacement order form and credit note. We're defaulting the workflow stage 01 with the customer, and by default we put the item on a replacement order, and we're going to have 0 value on that replacement order. And for our miscellaneous detail lines, we're going to default that it goes onto the credit note, and it also has a 01 workflow stage. And our RMA processing rules are defaulting the RA prefix to RET, and we're going to match the credit note to the original invoice. Invoice is required on all items, and we're allowed to change status codes and description fields after the RMA is complete. And we've assigned this RET template to customer 1100 and customer 1210. So when we go ahead and create a new RMA for customer 1100 or 1210, the template code RET defaults. We get our defaults from the template happening, and we get our miscellaneous charge code, and this time it is defaulting to the price that we created on our OE miscellaneous charges, in this case $10. And we're going to build our RMA based on the original invoice. So selecting the invoice and clicking the Go button will default all the items from the invoice, but the quantity will be defaulted as 0 because that's what the rule we set on our template. So if we add this RMA, and from here we could email it through to the customer. After the customer received the return instruction, maybe they phoned to say they were returning one additional item and they don't know the invoice number for that particular item. In this case, when we go to add the item to the RMA, we're getting an error message. The original invoice number cannot be blank, and that is because of our template rules. And in this case, if we do need to override our template rules, we can approve the RMA. If I click on the RMA approval and enter the approver and my password, once the RMA is approved, now we can go ahead and add items without an invoice or that contradict any of the rules on the template. Now when the goods arrive, you would come and update your RMA, change the workflow stage and status codes, enter fault codes or repair agents if appropriate, update the quantities, and select the target documents to which the item detail will go to. And you would do this for all the items on the RMA. And if that's my RMA now complete, I can complete the header and go ahead and create the credit note and create the replacement order. So in this case, it will go through all the lines that have been flagged to go on the replacement order. It will put those items onto the sales order, and we can drill into it from here or the detail on the individual RMA line or lines that went onto the replacement order. And we can see it's come from RET return number 12. And there's our item. And the unit price is 0. And now we can ship and zero value invoice this order to send the replacement goods out to the customer. The next template code we're going to look at is one for warranty repairs, where you're going to create sales orders for the parts and labor. On our template rules, we're going to use the template numbering WAR, and from a warranty repair, we're typically going to create zero value replacement orders for parts and labor. We're going to create the RMA from an existing invoice document, and we're going to add spare parts at no charge to the customer. And from there, we're going to create a replacement order to ship an invoice, albeit at zero value, the spare parts and the labor. Here we're going to look at our template code WAR. The description and comment is going to default. There's no restocking fee. We're using a salesperson code of WAR for the spare parts to be shipped. And on the item detail, we typically only put items onto the replacement order at zero value. And same with miscellaneous charges if we're going to charge labor. And we're going to match the credit note to the invoice if we do issue a credit note, but the invoice is required on all items that we're going to be repairing, and our documents are going to be prefixed WAR. And we've assigned the warranty repairs to our customer 1600. So when the customer says he's going to send in some items for warranty repairs, we can select it from the invoice and click the Go button to get the items from that invoice onto our RMA. And in this case, there were 3 items. And looking at the detail, and if the customer said he was returning the fluorescent desk lamp from invoice 24 that we're going to repair, so when we send out the spare parts, we don't want to reissue this fluorescent desk lamp, so it won't go onto the replacement order. And perhaps this item is not coming back for warranty repairs, so we'll delete that. And this item perhaps also is not coming back. They're only returning 1 item from that invoice. So we could go ahead and add the RMA and email the customer the return instruction. And when the item is returned, we can update the status to say we are now working or inspecting on this or sending it to the repair agent and working on this particular item. And now for this RMA, because I said that the invoice was mandatory on all items, I would need to approve the RMA before I can add the spare parts to this line. Otherwise, it's going to be prompting me for the invoice number for the spare parts. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this RMA. And here I need to be a user which has the tick box approved by in the approvals and say, yes, I'm approving it. So now I can come and add the spare parts and the labor needed to this RMA without specifying an invoice number. And before we complete the RMA, we would just check, is our labor charge going to go onto our replacement order? And is our spare parts going to go onto our placements order? So even though they're going on at zero value, at least you can keep track of the labor and the spare parts that were done on this particular warranty repair. So when I complete the RMA, I can now create the order. And drilling into the order, we will see the miscellaneous charge at zero value, the item at zero value, the spare parts at zero value, and the salesperson is the warranty salesperson. The reason I had 3 items when I was expecting only 2, because I forgot to deselect put item on replacement order for the original returned item. Had you not wanted to approve the RMA, you could have had your template not make the invoice mandatory on all items, and then you would just put the spare parts and labor onto the RMA. And the last example we're going to look at is a repairs template to create a sales order and charge for parts and labor. The template rules, we're going to be using a numbering REP, and typically we're going to create a sales order with a value. And in this case, we're going to use template RMAs for the job. So we're going to create an RMA to repair a desk lamp and a template to repair a filing cabinet. And then we can use those to quickly populate the spare parts and labor that we need. Then we're going to create the RMA using the RMA template document. We're going to add parts and labor and any charges we would need to. And then we're going to create a sales order for the parts and labor. You can create RMA documents and use those as templates for new RMA documents. I have 2 RMA document templates. The first one, when I repair a desk lamp, I have a replacement part for the desk lamp and a miscellaneous labor charge. And when I repair a filing cabinet, I have these 2 spare parts and a labor charge. So we'll be using this template for our RMA. And our repairs template would have some default values for the headers, an individual salesperson code to track the spare parts and labor. We don't need to set any defaults on the item detail or the RMA miscellaneous detail because these will come from the individual repair templates that we select. And on the RMA processing tab, the credit note is not matched and the invoice is not required on all items. And we're using REP in the template numbering. And typically for our repairs, we would assign for our customer, we would assign the repairs template for those customers that do repairs. And if it's a walk-in, perhaps we don't create a customer for that individual customer, we just use our cash customer. So when the item arrives in the warehouse for repair, for our cash customer, it's defaulting to our repairs template. And this time we're going to select our RMA document based on the TR codes that we've set up. And if we're doing a repair to a filing cabinet, we could go ahead and put the default spare parts that we use for a filing cabinet. And in this case, it's 1 of the first item, 3 of the next item, and a labor charge of $500. And if that was it, our work done, we could add, before clicking complete and our replacement documents, we should just check that all these items are going onto our replacement order and it's not zero value as per our template rule. So when we complete and create our replacement order and drill into that document, we can see the items with the order value, and now we can go ahead, ship all, and invoice. On the reporting side, we have the return authorization report, which is intended to send to the customer. And this is the same report that gets called as and when you save each RMA document. But we also have a form which is intended to send down to the warehouse for the warehouse to expect the goods to come in so they know what to do with that particular RMA. when it arrives from the customer. On the analytical reports side, we've got a report which shows you all open or closed RMAs or complete RMAs in a number range or for a particular customer. So here we've got all our open RMAs. And you can also run a report for all the RMAs in a particular stage or status or for a particular customer. So if you wanted to see which RMA lines that you were waiting on customers, you could use the stage code 01 and it would show all the RMAs that you're still waiting to receive from your customers. Or you could use any stage, perhaps all the RMAs that have been sent to a repair agent and haven't yet been returned. So using the status and stage codes, you can report on exceptions from your RMAs. We've also got a fault code analysis report. So if you are assigning fault codes to items, then you can print by RMA number range, customer number range, or just fault code number range to see which items have a recurring fault. And you can print RMAs by issued credit notes or by serial and lot number. But on the analytical side, we have two reports which focuses on customers and items. Let's first look at the customer's return rate report. And if you run this report for a customer number range and print in summary, at a high level, it shows you what the total dollar value of sales for the customer is and the total dollar value of returns for that customer in the date range that you've specified. So here, for example, Bargain Mart has purchased $3,000 and returned $59. Ronald Black has purchased $13,000 and returned $1,100. So you can get an idea at a high level which are your high returns customers, and it shows by quantity the percentage of returns as opposed to sales. But having run this report in summary, you could then go and run for an individual customer and print in detail. And now it shows only those items that have been returned, total dollar value of sales and total dollar value of returns. So we have 93 sold and 7 returned, 83 sold and 6 returned. And our return rate is 7.65% as a percentage of quantity sold. And we have the similar analysis report, but this time it's focusing on items. So if we run in summary, we're getting total quantity sold and quantity returned. And then if we run for an item number range in detail, we would see the individual customers that these items have been sold to and how much of those items each customer has returned. So Ronald Black has bought 93 and returned 7. And our item return rate is 10.73 as a percentage of sales. And finally, in the periodic processing, we can clear down completed RMAs or expired RMAs. So completed RMAs that were completed up to and including this date, or if you select clear expired RMA documents, it will clear down those documents which are X days older than the through date entered here. Now that we've reviewed the different options in the templates, if you go back to your RA options, if a company always uses a particular template code, you could define it here, and then all RMAs that get created will always default to that template code. And at this level, you can allow blank status codes or fault codes as well. And if you don't use templates, you can have your number, prefix, and length defined at an overall company-wide level too. In our 4 examples, we have seen the importance of the RMA templates and having your document checks set up on the RMA Processing tab, the number prefixes on the Processing tab, and your status and fault codes and which documents you want to create, the replacement order, if it's going to be 0 value, the credit note, if it's going to be 0 value, and the vendor return on their RMA detail and miscellaneous charge. And also when creating an RMA, you can choose the default lines from an existing invoice, or by serial number, by lot number, or an item number from an invoice. And we also saw how you could use an RMA document as your template. So in summary, we've seen in the RMA setup, you need to do your options, your authorization, status, workflow, stage, fault code, and repair agent codes. And then you need to define your RMA templates and then link customers to templates and create RMA document templates if you're using them. And you can also define item policies to control when credit notes can be issued and when replacement orders can be made. And then on the data entry side, we saw 2 returns being created and 2 repairs being created, 1 warranty repair and 1 repair where we were charging. And we had a look at the reporting by the item return rate, the customer return rate, and the different reports you have by fault code, stage, status, whether they're open or closed, and if we've issued a credit note for the RMA. And in periodic processing, we've seen that you can clear old completed RMAs and clear expired RMAs. Thank you for watching this training video on RMAs. For more information on RMA and other Orchid products, please go to www.orchid.systems.